Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series. Today I have a piece of history for you that is ingrained in every single English person from the time they begin attending school. This is one of the earliest pieces of history I ever remember learning, and it's possibly one of the more important pieces of British history. But I've recently discovered that most people outside of Britain have no idea why on the 5th of November every year we celebrate Fireworks Night or Bonfire Night or Guy Fawkes Night, however you want to refer to it as. And most people only know the name Guy Fawkes from V for Vendetta. The night has got loads of different names, but no matter what you refer to it as, the origin remains the same, and I'm going to tell you all about it today. We have a saying in the UK, and that's remember the 5th of November. Every year on the 5th of November, people across the UK gather at public and sometimes private displays to set off fireworks, light large bonfires, and traditionally burn effigies of a man called Guy Fawkes. It's actually one of my favourite nights of the year. I love getting all bundled up in my hat and scarf and gloves and going to my local display to watch the fireworks and eat some good food. But why do we do this every year? It's to celebrate Guy Fawkes' foiled attempt to blow up Parliament and kill the King on the 5th of November 1605. It's a yearly tradition that's now over 400 years old, and of course it all started with politics and religion, as so much of history does. Though I will say that this video is rather free of any blatant misogyny, so yay for that, the first one so far. But instead we've just got a whole load of religious persecution. But before we get into this video, I'd like to thank Magellan TV for once again sponsoring me. I couldn't do what I do here without Magellan TV. They are amazing. They are a documentary streaming site with hundreds of documentaries about a huge range of different topics. For somebody who watches as many documentaries as I do, it really is incredible to have a whole streaming service dedicated to them. I cannot recommend Magellan TV enough. They have everything from true crime, science, history, nature, and everything in between. New programmes are added weekly that can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. And it's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K as well. As you may know, I always like to give you a couple of documentary recommendations at the end of this, a couple of documentaries that I've been watching and enjoying. So this week I have Arctic Manhunt, Hunt for the Mad Trapper. It's basically a documentary following a group of scientists who are trying to discover the true identity of the culprit of a series of unsolved murders across the Canadian Arctic. It's really interesting, a nice element of mystery there. And also, in line with today's video, I'm going to recommend a series called Closer to Truth, which is 10 26-minute episodes which bring together leading people in science and theology to explore the relationship between science and religion. I haven't finished it yet, I'm a few episodes in, but it's really interesting. Our story begins with Guy Fawkes, who was born in April 1570 in Stonegate, York, to Edward and Edith Fawkes. He was baptised into the Protestant church about 3 days after his birth at the Church of St Michael le Belfry in York. In 1579, when Guy was just 8 years old, his father dies, and so several years later his mother remarries to a man called Dionys Bainbridge. Dionys was a Catholic, and Guy becomes influenced by his stepfather's Catholic practices and later officially converts to Catholicism himself, despite the fact that it was actually illegal to be Catholic at the time. And this is where things get all political and all monarchy, so I hope you can keep up with this. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to the Tudors. This is kind of like my historical bread and butter. To truly understand why the events of the 5th of November 1605 took place, there's some really important context you need to know. So in 1517, something called the Reformation began in Europe when a German monk called Martin Luther protested the Catholic Church. He didn't agree with many of its practices. Many people just thought the Pope had too much power, and people who adopted these ideas of Martin Luther became known as Protestants, and this slowly spread across the continent. But the British revolt against the Pope didn't actually come around as a consequence of Martin Luther and other reformers' work. That all came round with Henry VIII. Now, I will do a full video on Henry at some point. He is my favourite British monarch and he's really interesting to talk about. So I'll try and keep this as brief and to the point as I can. So Henry himself was a strong Catholic and he had a real, genuine faith. And in fact, he remained Catholic until his dying day. He's often regarded as being the one to break England away from the Catholic Church, which was kind of the truth, but himself, he was a Catholic until the day he died. He was just a little bit selfish by today's standard, and that kind of had a bit of a snowball effect on history. The English Reformation basically began with Henry's quest for a male heir. You see, he'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for a while, and she had borne him many children, but only one child had survived, Princess Mary. And it was pretty obvious by this point that Catherine of Aragon wouldn't be having any more kids. But Henry wanted a son, he wanted an heir to the throne. And besides this, Henry kind of viewed his marriage to Catherine as a bit of an embarrassment anyway, because she had previously been married to his brother, Arthur, and Leviticus forbade the marriage of a man with his deceased brother's widow. At the time of the marriage, the Pope at the time, Julius II, had given a dispensation to cover this infraction, even though Catherine insisted that her and Arthur's marriage had never been consummated, so it didn't really count anyway. So when they got married, he got permission from the Pope that this was all alright. But when Henry decides that he wants to annul his marriage to Catherine and instead marry Anne Boleyn, he goes to the new Pope, Clement VII, to ask for permission. And he's refused. So instead, in 1534, Henry VIII declares that he alone should be the final authority in matters relating to the English Church. He takes away any papal authority and he sets up the independent Church of England, with himself, the King, as the supreme head. And seeing as he is now the one in charge of the church, he can just go ahead and divorce Catherine so he can marry Anne instead. He dissolves England's monasteries to confiscate all of their wealth, and he ensures to put the Bible in the hands of the people rather than the churches. By 1536, every single parish was required to have a copy of the Bible translated into English from Latin. Previously, Bibles were only in Latin, and they were only sort of held by the big people in the church. But Henry didn't actually change any of the doctrines or institutions of the church. Those all remained the same. So of course some people happily go along with this new Church of England, but a lot of people were really staunch in their Catholic beliefs. England was a pretty Catholic country at the time, and they were horrified at this sudden change in religion. So after Henry dies, his son Edward VI takes the throne in 1547. He was the son of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. For 6 years, Edward advances the Protestant faith in England and just completely reforms how the country celebrated their faith. The Latin Catholic Mass is no longer used, a Book of Common Prayer is introduced, written in English, not Latin, statues of saints are removed, and priests are ordered to wear plain robes. No lavish ornaments or idols were allowed. But then Edward dies and Queen Mary I becomes queen in 1553 after a short detour where Lady Jane Grey takes charge for just 9 days. Mary is still very known for her very aggressive attempt to reverse the Reformation and turn England back to the Catholic faith. She became known as Bloody Mary for reasons. During her 5-year reign, she had over 280 religious dissenters burnt at the stake. All Protestant, of course, and most of them just common citizens. She would literally just kill people for being Protestant. She rules for 5 years, then she dies, and then in 1558, when Elizabeth I takes the crown, one of her first royal actions was to establish the English Protestant Church, of which she makes herself the supreme governor. Now, Elizabeth was always quite mild. She never really stood up for much of anything. She was just like quite laid back, I suppose. She didn't restore the Protestant church enough for some English Protestants though, particularly the Puritans. The third video in 2 weeks where the Puritans popped up. Very strange. But first she tried to promote this middle way in religion. She wanted to create an inclusive Protestant church that allowed her to be an authority while still enabling former Catholics to feel like they could follow Protestant forms of worship. So she keeps a lot of the Catholic aspects of the church, including the robes, the decorations, the bishops and the priests. At first anyway. Later on in her reign she begins to persecute the Catholics, and by the end of her reign England is a fully Protestant country and Catholicism was illegal. She punished the Puritans and any recusants who refused to go to Church of England services. The Pope actually excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570. After Elizabeth's 44-year stay on the throne, James I takes over. Now, he was Protestant himself, but he was more tolerant towards the Catholics than Elizabeth had been. Although technically it was still illegal to be Catholic, it was frowned upon, very much so. And that's where we come full circle back around to Guy Fawkes. He was Catholic, it was bad to be Catholic. In 1592, Guy sails overseas to join the Catholic Spanish army, which was fighting the Protestant Dutch forces over the control of the Netherlands, which was called the 80 Years' War. Over the next 10 years, Guy rises through the ranks of the Spanish military until he's eventually recommended for a captaincy. During this time, he starts going by Guido Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, the Italian version of his name. In 1603, he petitions for the Catholic king there, Philip III, to wage war against Protestant King James I, but King Philip politely declines. It's shortly after this that people started to hear of this Catholic guy in Spain who's really trying to fight for change, and Guy Fawkes is introduced to Thomas Wintour, a fellow English Catholic, who is just as fed up as he is. Wintour tells Guy of a group of Catholic conspirators who are coming up with a plot to assassinate the king, and hopefully restore the country back to Catholicism by replacing him with his daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Now, this group was led by a man called Robert Catesby, and they were particularly interested in Guy because of how he was a man highly skilled in matters of war, and he had a very deep understanding of explosives. Guy was a smart man with a cause, and that's just what the conspirators needed. So for 18 months, Guy, Robert, Thomas and 10 others come up with a plan to blow up the House of Lords with the king still inside. This group was funded in part by a man called Thomas Percy, and eventually Percy gains access to a house in London that belonged to the keeper of the king's wardrobe. It was a property really close to Parliament. Fawkes took the pseudonym John Johnson and started acting as a servant Percy, and it's been claimed that the conspirators attempted to dig a tunnel from underneath this house of the keeper of the king's clothes all the way to Parliament, and that's still pretty widely believed. However, there's never actually been any proof of this tunnel whatsoever. It's never been found, and even at the later trial, no evidence of any tunnel was presented. It just seems to be something that's sort of become an urban legend. They never tried to dig a tunnel. But whilst they were at the keeper's house, they discovered that the tenant's now widow was clearing out a nearby undercroft, basically a cellar or a storage room, and this undercroft just happened to be directly underneath the House of Lords, which was a bit of a stroke of luck for the conspirators, and certainly easier access than digging a tunnel all the way there. So the conspirators begin to lease this undercroft. It was the perfect place to start hoarding / hiding the gunpowder the plotters had been planning to use. At first they bring in 20 barrels of gunpowder, soon followed by 16 more. They were planning to see their plot through very soon, but of course London was hit by the plague, as it always was, and so the opening of Parliament was delayed until Tuesday the 5th of November. So the conspirators had to put their plan back a couple of months. Guy uses this opportunity to actually travel back to mainland Europe and start trying to gain foreign support for their plot. They tell people, and of course some of this information does get into the wrong hands. Eventually Guy returns back to England and realises that some of the gunpowder has decayed, so he brings even more in, along with some firewood to conceal it. It's decided that on the night the plot was to take place, Guy was going to be the one to light the fuse, and then he was going to escape across the Thames. At the same time this was happening, a revolt was going to happen in the Midlands, and Princess Elizabeth, their future monarch, would be captured. Guy would then head straight to Europe, where he would explain that he was still a good Catholic, even though he has just killed loads of people, including the king, because he was doing it for the good of the faith. He was basically going to go to like the heads of the Catholic Church and beg for forgiveness. But a few of the conspirators were concerned about fellow Catholics who would be at Parliament at its opening. It wasn't going to be only King James there, of course, there were going to be hundreds of men there. It was a pretty big night, the opening of Parliament. On the evening of the 26th of October, Catholic Lord Monteagle receives a letter warning him in cryptic words to stay away from Parliament on the 5th of November. We still don't know who sent Monteagle this letter. Some think that he knew about the plot and authored the letter himself, wanting to get in favour with the king. If it wasn't him writing it himself, it would have either had to be someone who really cared for him or someone who wanted to out the plot without outing themselves, because anyone with sense would have known that the Lord would immediately show it to people. He takes it straight to Robert Cecil, the first Earl of Salisbury, who then shows it to the king. But the conspirators, even though they kind of know that this letter's got out, continue on with their plot. Nothing really happened immediately, and the king is shown the letter and they just assume that everyone would think it would be a hoax. So Guy checks the Undercroft on the 30th of November and it's undisturbed. No one has been down there, so they just assume that nobody took it seriously. But in the early hours of the 5th of November, the King ordered a search to be conducted of the cellars under Parliament. Lord Monteagle searches alongside a man called Thomas Howard, and they find the stash of gunpowder and explosives. Guy Fawkes is already there and he's caught leaving the cellar just after midnight. He's immediately arrested and searched, found to have matches on him. He's imprisoned in the Tower of London and gives his name as John Johnson, the alias he always used whilst he was in England. At first, he gives nothing away. He says nothing of his fellow plotters and nothing of his real identity. But he does admit, with glee it seems, that his intention was to blow up Parliament. He expresses regret that he failed to do so, and he remains steadfast in his silence. It's actually been reported that King James apparently admired how this guy was able to remain so calm and silent in the face of adversity. But the admiration only went so far. James ordered that John Johnson be tortured to reveal the names of the other conspirators, and so John Johnson, Guy Fawkes, is hung from the ceiling by manacles before maybe being placed in the rack, hands and feet tied and essentially stretched and tortured. And he did eventually break his silence on the 7th of November, telling of a few other people involved in the plot. He dictates his confession before signing it, Guy Fawkes. His trial begins on Monday the 27th of January 1606, along with 7 of his fellow plotters. He pleaded not guilty, despite the signed confession and the fact that he was literally caught red-handed. It didn't work though, of course, and each conspirator is found guilty of high treason. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, told the court that each of the condemned would be drawn backwards to his death by a horse, his head near the ground, so he'd be dragged backwards by a horse. They were then to be put to death halfway between heaven and earth as unworthy of both. Their genitals would be cut off and burnt before their eyes, and their bowels and hearts removed. They would then be decapitated, and the dismembered parts of their bodies were to be displayed, so they might become prey for the fowls of the air. Nice. So on the 31st of January 1606, Guy Fawkes is dragged by horse to the old palace yard at Westminster, just opposite Parliament, which he intended to blow up. His fellow plotters are hanged to near death, not complete death, before they're pulled down and quartered whilst they're still alive. Guy is the last to stand on the scaffold, having most likely just watched what's happened to everyone else. He begins to climb the ladder to the noose, but purposefully, maybe, jumps from the scaffold early in order to break his neck. By doing so, he died immediately and he managed to avoid having his organs removed from his body whilst he was still alive. But they do it anyway. He's cut into quarters and he's sent to different corners of the country where he's put on public display for all to see. A lesson for all: don't try to commit treason. On the 5th of November, London had been informed of the King's miraculous escape from assassination, and they were told to celebrate if they wanted by lighting big bonfires. A later Act of Parliament designated each 5th of November as a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the King surviving. This remained in force in law until 1859, but even after that, people continued to celebrate to this very day. And that is why on the 5th of November every year the British celebrate Bonfire Night. The King didn't get blown up! Yay! Eventually, fireworks, powered by gunpowder, joined in on the bonfire celebrations, and it became custom to burn an effigy of Guy Fawkes made from sticks, newspapers and old clothes. My local firework night still does this every year. The effigy is burned every year on top of the bonfire. An anarchist plot foiled by just a stroke of luck. Ever since the gunpowder plot over 400 years ago, whenever the monarch is to visit Parliament, there is a tradition that the yeomen of the guard have to search beneath the Houses of Parliament for any potential explosives. That still happens to this very day. Some people hail Guy Fawkes as a good guy. James Sharp, a professor of history at the University of York, said how Guy Fawkes was the last man to enter Parliament with honest intentions. So, you know, take from that what you will. Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? I suppose it depends what you believe. To be honest, most people nowadays do not celebrate Bonfire Night with Guy Fawkes or Parliament in mind. It's just a bit of fun, the one night of the year where entire communities get together and watch lights go bang in the sky. But it's something that the British still do every single year, and now you know why. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you learnt something interesting. Let me know down below what historical events you would like me to cover next, and make sure you check out Magellan TV in the top line of the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.